What did freedom mean to a girl who had never been allowed to own even her own name? That was the question the old world left behind, buried beneath sand, ceremony, and the polished lies of kings. The temples remembered victories. The walls remembered gods. The scribes remembered taxes, harvests, offerings, royal births, and the weight of grain carried into storehouses. But almost nowhere did they remember her. A girl like Nefaret rarely entered history by the front gate. She entered through a side door, through hunger, through a father's lowered eyes, through a mother's hands trembling in a bowl of water, through a road at dawn, when the village was still half asleep and the palms were black against the first gray of morning. Long after the palace that took her had cracked under sun and time, long after the men who owned rooms and bodies and futures had become dust themselves, one could still imagine her standing there, small, oiled, silent, dressed not for comfort but for appraisal. Her chin raised by another person's hand. Her face turned toward the light. Her body examined before her soul had learned how to defend itself. The world around her had called this order. The priests might have called it necessity. The officials might have called it arrangement. Her father, had he found the courage to speak honestly, might have called it the only door left open when every field had closed. But history, when stripped of perfume and gold, would have called it by a colder name. It was the moment a child discovered that love could exist inside betrayal, and betrayal could wear the face of love. Before the palace, there had been mud brick. There had been the low roof of a small house near the Nile, where the air smelled of river water, straw, smoke, and bread when there was bread enough to bake. The ceiling had been so low that her father bent each time he crossed the doorway, though he did it without complaint. Men who owned little learned early to fold themselves around the world. Her mother had carried water, her father had worked linen, her brothers had chased birds from the grain with the fierce seriousness of boys entrusted with a kingdom no larger than a field, and Nefaret had been beautiful before beauty became dangerous. Her name meant beautiful, but in those early years the word had not yet become a sentence passed over her body. It had been a blessing spoken by a mother who still believed that naming a child could protect her. Her mother had given her that name in the kind of hope poor women carried quietly, not the hope of palaces, not jewels, not servants, not soft beds, but the hope that a daughter might grow safely, laugh often, marry kindly, and never be noticed by the powerful. In the village, happiness had been made of plain things, a heel of bread still warm from the fire, a brother's muddy hands, a strip of shade during the worst hour of afternoon, the sound of her father laughing once, perhaps twice. At dusk, when labor had ended and worry had not yet become large enough to swallow the room. Poor families did not always speak of happiness because they had no time to decorate it. They lived inside it quickly, hungrily, before it vanished. A good flood, a full jar, a healthy child, a roof still standing after wind, these were not small things. They were the pillars of the world, but then the river changed its voice. At first, no one wanted to call it disaster. People rarely do when disaster arrives slowly. They give it smaller names, names that can fit inside the mouth without breaking the teeth. A difficult season, a poor rise, a bad year. The first year, her father still spoke with the authority of a man trying to convince the gods by convincing his own children. The Nile had failed before, he said. It would rise again. The fields would mend. The grain would return. Hunger was a visitor, not a ruler. The second year, he stopped saying such things. The field hardened, the cracks in the earth widened like old wounds, meals shrank until they became gestures rather than nourishment. Her younger brother asked once for more bread and then, after seeing their mother's face, learned not to ask again. That was how children aged in those days. Not by birthdays, but by the first desire they swallowed in silence. Nefaret watched her father sit at the edge of the field while the sun went down. His shoulders seemed to carry an invisible sack. In later years, when she tried to understand him, she would return again and again to that image, a man seated before useless earth, his hands empty, his children hungry behind him, the river indifferent. It did not forgive him, but it explained the shape of his despair, and despair, in the ancient world, had merchants. They came in clean sandals, 2 men, at first. Their clothes were too fine for the village dust. Their rings caught the sun. They spoke softly with men who wanted to be discreet, but secrecy had a sound of its own. Even children could hear it. They did not speak to Nefaret. That was one of the first lessons. Objects were discussed in their presence. Animals were priced in their presence. Children, when the world became cruel enough, could be treated the same way. She remembered carrying water from the canal and feeling their eyes follow her movements. Not the eyes of neighbors, not the eyes of family, not the distracted glance of someone passing by. These eyes measured. They calculated. They saw not a daughter, not a child, not a person with a name chosen in tenderness, but potential. Potential value, potential obedience, potential beauty ripened into profit. Her father nodded once during that first visit. Slowly. Not as a man who agreed, but as a man who had found the wall behind him and discovered there was no door in it. When the men left, her mother went inside. No argument followed. No cry. No crash of pottery. That silence frightened Nefaret more than anger would have. Silence meant the thing had already entered the house and taken a seat among them. The next morning, her mother washed her hair twice. Nefaret remembered the second washing for the rest of her life. The water was cooler than usual. Her mother's fingers moved carefully through her hair. Separating, smoothing, rinsing. Then came oil, the better oil, the kind kept for festivals and sacred days, when women wished to stand before others and be seen with dignity. But there was no festival. No song. No decorated doorway. No laughter from neighbors, only her mother's hands, only the smell of oil, only the instruction to stand straight, lift your chin. Nefaret obeyed. Do not look at the ground. She obeyed again. Her mother's voice had become strange, as though it belonged to a woman speaking from the bottom of a well. She corrected the girl's posture, the angle of her shoulders, the stillness of her hands. It was preparation disguised as grooming. A ritual of surrender performed by the person who loved her most. That was the wound history rarely knew how to record. Cruelty was not always done by strangers. Sometimes strangers merely arrived to collect what poverty had already condemned. That night, Nefaret heard whispering behind a closed door. Her father's voice, low and strained. Her mother's voice, sharper, then breaking, then low again. The transaction itself was not dramatic. That was what made it unbearable. No thunder rolled. No god shattered a statue. No official declared the moral collapse of the household. There was only a yard, the heat, men with practiced voices, a scribe with papyrus, and a father holding a small pouch as if it burned his palm. The third man, the one who wrote, did not look cruel. That, too, mattered. Cruelty often survived because it learned to appear ordinary. He wrote quickly, confidently, with the clean indifference of someone recording grain, livestock, labor, debt. His hand did not shake. Why would it? The world had taught him that some lives could be converted into marks. Nefaret stood nearby. No one told her to go inside. No one invited her to understand. She was present in the way a jar was present during its sale. Her mother stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, not in anger but in self-restraint, as if she had to hold her own body together to keep from breaking apart. Her younger brother sat in the dust, drawing lines with a stick, still mercifully ignorant. For years afterward, Nefaret would envy him that ignorance. To sit beside a catastrophe and not yet know its name was a kind of blessing. Her father counted what was in the pouch. He closed it. The scribe made the final sign, and with that, the life her mother had imagined for her was severed. It took less time than baking bread. This was one of history's most obscene efficiencies, how quickly a human being could be transferred when enough men agreed not to call her human in the necessary way. That evening, her father sat beside her outside the house. He held her hand. For a long time, he said nothing. The sun had gone low. The village noises softened. Somewhere a goat complained. Somewhere a woman called a child home. The world continued its ordinary music, and Nefaret hated it for continuing. When her father finally spoke, he told her the palace would be safe. He told her she would eat. He told her there would be walls, attendants, order. He told her it was an honor. Then he said it again, and again, until the words lost meaning and became a plea, not to her, to himself. She looked at his hand around hers. It was rough, dry, cracked from work and worry. It trembled slightly. That tremor was the confession his mouth could not make. He did not believe what he was saying, but hunger had made a coward of truth. That night, her mother cried in the next room. Nefaret did not. Children often understand, before adults admit it, that tears can be a luxury. She pressed her face into the fabric beneath her and breathed until breathing became her only task. She listened to grief through the wall. She listened to the house remembering her before she had even gone. Before dawn, two women arrived. Not the men from before, women. That was how the wound was softened, perhaps. Or hidden. Or made administratively easier. Women came to collect the girl from her mother's house because women knew how to touch a frightened child without leaving bruises visible to the road. Nefaret carried a small bundle, a comb, a bit of cloth, a memory small enough to fit in her hands. Her father embraced her so tightly her ribs hurt. It was the only moment when his body told the truth. Her younger brother waved from the doorway, believing perhaps that she would return by midday with a story. As people returned from markets and temples in neighboring houses, she did not look back. The decision, made by a child, contained more strength than many kings displayed in all their reigns. She knew that if she turned and saw her mother, saw the doorway, saw her brother's hand in the morning light, she might refuse to move. And if she refused, the pouch would be returned, or the debt would remain, or the family would starve, or worse men would come later. So she walked, one foot, then another. The village receded behind palms, and the world that had named her beautiful disappeared. The palace rose from the horizon like a painted lie. To a village child, it seemed less built than summoned. Walls climbed against the sky. Columns stood like stone trees. Colors flashed in the sun: red, blue, gold, green, all too vivid, too confident, too untouched by hunger. The place appeared to belong not merely to people, but to a different law of existence. In the village, every object had use. Here, objects also had meaning. A wall did not only protect, it declared power. A corridor did not only connect rooms, it arranged obedience. A painted lotus did not only decorate stone, it insisted that beauty and domination could share the same surface. Servants moved everywhere. Men carrying trays. Boys carrying messages. Women carrying linen. Guards standing beneath shadows with spears that seemed less like weapons than reminders. No one moved aimlessly. No one looked upward for long. The palace had taught every body its proper angle. That was the second great lesson. Power did not need to shout when architecture could do the speaking. At the inner gate, a woman waited. She was older, controlled, with eyes that seemed to have survived everything by expecting nothing. Her name was Hanat. She looked over Nefaret without softness, though not without understanding. There was a difference, and Nefaret would only learn it later. Hanat recited rules in a voice emptied of decoration. Do not wander. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not ask where others have gone. Do not speak of the family behind you. Learn quickly. Suffer less. Learn slowly. Suffer more. The palace, Hanat implied, was merciful only to those who mistook obedience for wisdom. Nefaret nodded. The room where she was taken held other girls. 6 of them. Some older, some younger, all silent in the way newly captured birds are silent before they decide whether the cage is real. One girl cried quietly in the corner, not loudly enough to draw punishment, only enough to prove to herself that she had not yet become stone. Nefaret sat on a mat. She placed her bundle beside her. Inside it was a blue bead, small and cold. It had no value in the palace. Therefore it had immeasurable value. She pressed it between her fingers and remembered the field, the house, the low ceiling, her mother's hands. Memory, in places like that, had to be smuggled in through small things. A bead. A strip of cloth. A song never sung aloud. A name spoken only inside the skull. Training began before dawn. The palace did not train girls to become better versions of themselves. It trained them to become useful illusions. Nefaret learned how to walk again, though she had walked since infancy. Her village walk was wrong, too practical, too personal, too much shaped by dust, chores, water jars, uneven ground. Palace walking required silence, line, rhythm, awareness of being seen. Every step had to suggest grace while concealing fear. She learned to pour wine without spilling. She learned to hold a fan at the correct height. She learned where to lower her eyes. She learned when stillness was safer than motion. She learned to paint the eyes so that beauty became a mask and a weapon used by others. She learned that a girl could be in a room and yet be trained not to occupy it as a person. Presence without self. Visibility without voice. That was the palace art. Hanat watched everything. A shoulder too tense. A hand too quick. A glance too direct. A breath taken at the wrong moment. The older woman's corrections were precise and unsentimental. Yet on the third day, after Nefaret completed a sequence without error, Hanat gave one small nod. One nod. Nothing more. Nefaret carried it with her for weeks. In a place designed to strip meaning from her, even the smallest acknowledgement became shelter. Months passed, though at first time did not feel like time. It felt like repetition wearing different light. Morning drills. Meals. Instruction. Silence. Lamps. Whispers. Sleep. The smell of incense drifting from temple quarters. The sound of metal, sandals, water, chanting. The Nile rising and falling beyond the walls, faithful to rhythms older than kings. The palace was full of women. That was another truth hidden behind official histories of men. Women washed, dressed, listened, carried, prepared, watched, warned, betrayed, protected, endured. They knew routes through corridors that officials never considered important enough to map. They knew who had favor, who had lost it, who was ill, who had angered whom, whose silence meant fear, whose kindness might be a trap. In that hidden republic of women, Nefaret found Itet. Itet had a small scar on her chin from some childhood accident she described differently each time. Sometimes she had fallen from a wall. Sometimes a goat had kicked her. Sometimes, when she wanted to be dramatic, she claimed she had fought a crocodile and spared its life. She talked too much. She laughed too suddenly. She had not learned how to make herself small in all the places the palace demanded. That made her dangerous. It also made her precious. At meals, Nefaret sat beside her. At night, when lamps dimmed and the room settled into the shallow breathing of frightened girls pretending to sleep, it had whispered foolish things. Stories. Complaints. Memories of food. Invented insults for officials. Dreams of stealing dates from a royal storeroom and escaping disguised as temple cats. Nefaret tried not to laugh. Then she did laugh, once, quietly into her blanket. The sound startled her. It had been so long since joy had emerged from her body without permission. Friendship in the palace was not encouraged because friendship reminded captives that they were real. To be witnessed by another person was to resist disappearance. To have someone notice whether you ate, whether you slept, whether your hands shook, this was a form of rebellion too small for guards to punish and too large for the soul to survive without. But the palace had time. It waited. It knew that all tenderness created new vulnerabilities. And one evening, Hanat called Nefaret aside. The older woman did not need to explain. Her eyes did it first. Then she said the words. Nefaret was ready. Ready. A word that had followed women to many terrible rooms. Ready did not mean willing. Ready did not mean grown. Ready meant prepared enough to be offered. That evening, two women bathed her in scented water. They worked with practiced quiet. Oil on the skin. Kohl around the eyes. Linen adjusted once, twice, 3 times. A gold cuff at the wrist. The cuff was beautiful in the way cages could be beautiful when made by artisans. One of the women held Nefaret's face between her hands. Breathe, she said. Not because breathing would save her. Because breathing was the only command left that belonged partly to herself. There were corridors in the palace she had never walked. That night she walked one. It was narrower than the others, darker, less ceremonial. The walls seemed to absorb sound. A guard opened a heavy door without looking at her. That refusal to look was not kindness, though perhaps he imagined it was. It was professional blindness. The kind that allowed men to serve systems without seeing the lives carry through them. Inside, a lamp burned on a stone table. The flame bent when the door closed. Nefaret stood near the window. Her hand smoothed her dress, though it did not need smoothing. She looked at the gold on her wrist, at the way it caught the lamp. For one passing instant she imagined tearing it off and throwing it across the room. She did not. The palace had already entered her muscles. The door opened. He came in as men of ownership entered rooms, not hurried, not uncertain, not asking permission from space or person. The room belonged to him. The lamp belonged to him. The guards outside belonged to him. The silence belonged to him. And so, by the laws of that world, did she. Many years later, when memory returned to that moment, Nefaret would not remember his first words clearly. Trauma often preserved the objects around an event more faithfully than the event itself. She remembered the lamp, the table, the smell of oil, the weight of the cuff, the sound of her own breathing, trained into calm. She remembered answering without her voice breaking. For a heartbeat, she felt pride. A small pride. A child's pride. The pride of remaining composed while standing at the edge of an abyss. But pride, in such a room, was a candle in a storm. It existed. It mattered. It was not enough. Before dawn, she returned to the women's quarters. Itet pretended to be asleep. Beside Neferet's mat sat a cup of water. That was all. No question. No pitying touch. No speech that would force the night into shape. Neferet drank in the dark. The water was room-warm and tasted faintly of clay. She lay down and stared upward until shadows thinned. Something had happened. The world had not stopped. That was almost the worst of it. The palace continued. The sun rose. Servants carried trays. Women painted eyes. Officials spoke of grain, tribute, ceremony, weather. The river moved. The gods received offerings. Nothing in the visible order of Egypt acknowledged that a girl had crossed an invisible border and could not return to the self who had stood before it. This, too, was how empires survived. They made private devastation administratively silent. After the first night, days did not become easier. They became known. There was a cruelty in that, and also a form of protection. The mind, when forced to endure what it cannot escape, begins to build corridors inside itself. It learns where not to look. It learns which thoughts produce panic and which produce numbness. It learns how to move the body through routines while keeping some inner chamber locked. Neferet noticed the change in herself before she understood it. At first, every footstep in the corridor tightened her chest. Then footsteps became information. Near. Far. Many. One. Guard. Servant. Messenger. Hanet. Unknown. Fear did not vanish. It became organized. She ate. She trained. She waited. She was summoned. She returned. The cup of water was there. She drank. She slept. She woke. The pattern repeated until the horror of it dulled at the edges. That dulling frightened her. She wondered whether survival was a kind of betrayal of the self who had first suffered. If one stopped flinching, did that mean one had accepted the wound? If one learned the rules, had the rules won? Hanet gave her an answer one morning without knowing the question had been asked. "You are smart," the older woman said. It was not praise. It was diagnosis. Smart women live longer here. Then, after a pause, foolish ones are remembered only by those who watched them disappear. In the women's quarters, politics moved quietly. Favor was food. Information was shelter. Beauty was currency. Pregnancy could be danger or elevation, depending on who claimed the story first. A woman named Kia had been summoned often. She sat with the stillness of someone who had learned that status was safest when performed without visible hunger. After Neferet began to be called more frequently, Kia stopped acknowledging her at meals. It was not open hostility. Open hostility wasted energy. It was a withdrawal of recognition, precise as a knife. Another woman, Haru, did the opposite. She sat closer. She offered extra bread. She asked how Nefaret slept. Whether she dreamed. Whether she bled regularly. Whether Hannet had spoken to her privately. Her voice was kind. Too kind. Nefaret had learned by then that kindness in the palace might be a cup of water or a hook hidden in fruit. She answered with truths emptied of usefulness. Yes, she slept. No, she did not dream. Yes, she was well. No, she had heard nothing. Haru smiled each time as if each hollow answer pleased her. That was when Nefaret began to understand that the palace did not merely imprison bodies. It recruited fear. It taught captives to watch one another, to translate every gesture, to consider whether mercy had been purchased by someone else. Then Itet fell ill. The illness came like heat trapped inside the body. Fever. Shivering. Refusal of food. Eyes unfocused. For 2 nights, Nefaret sat beside her when she should have slept. She dampened cloth and pressed it to Itet's forehead. She whispered stories Itet had once told her, returning foolishness as medicine. On the 3rd day, Haru appeared with a small clay jar. The healers had sent it, she said. It would help Itet sleep. She held the jar out. The room seemed to narrow around it. Nefaret looked at the jar, then at Haru's soft face, the gentle mouth, the patient eyes. She thought of extra bread. Questions. Smiles that lingered a breath too long. She thought of Kia's silence. She thought of girls whose mats became empty without explanation. Let the healers give it to her, Nefaret said. Haru's face did not change. Of course. She took the jar away. Nefaret never learned what was inside. In some histories, the absence of proof would erase the danger. But those who had lived under power knew better. Not every threat needed completion to be real. Sometimes survival depended on honoring suspicion before evidence arrived. Itet recovered. The first night she kept food down, she reached in the dark for Neferet's hand. Nefaret let her hold it. No words passed between them. Words would have been smaller than the silence. The palace took from Nefaret in layers. First the village. Then childhood. Then certainty. Then the simple belief that the body and the self were the same territory. But it failed, for a long time, to take observation. She watched. At first, watching had been fear. Later, it became method. She watched which guard drank too much and leaned his spear against the wrong wall. She watched which servant resented which overseer. She watched which doors were barred and which were merely assumed to be closed. She watched lamps, rotations, mealtimes, shadow patterns, the hour when fatigue made men careless. She did not yet call this planning. The mind often begins escape long before the body dares to admit it. Then Menet disappeared. Menet had been older than most. Quiet. Not meek, exactly, but drawn inward, like a person who had folded herself many times and hidden the original shape deep inside. One morning, her mat was empty. No announcement followed. No accusation. No farewell. The absence sat among them heavier than a body. Everyone noticed. No one asked. Nefaret stared at the space where Menet had slept. A mat could become a warning. Dust could become a document. A missing woman could become a law understood by all. That day, Nefaret began studying the faces of the others with new urgency. Some women moved as though their souls had stepped backward from their eyes. Some performed happiness so skillfully that even the performers may have forgotten where performance ended. Some allied themselves with power because proximity to danger felt safer than distance from it. Some grew cruel in small ways, not because they had been born cruel, but because cruelty was the only instrument left that gave them the sensation of agency. Nefaret wondered which one she was becoming. The question followed her through corridors. It sat beside her at meals. It lay down with her at night. Then another thought arrived, colder, more intimate, impossible to dismiss. What if she conceived? Not in the abstract way women discussed fertility near wells or fires. Not as a blessing sung over by family. Not as continuity, marriage, lineage, hope. But as consequence. As uncertainty. As a life inside her attached to power, violence, and mystery. She tried not to think it. The thought stayed. It was there when she poured wine. There when she painted her eyes. There when she heard footsteps. There when she saw Menet's empty mat in memory. The old world had knowledge of herbs, preparations, mixtures, remedies, and women's practices passed between hands and whispered from one generation to another. But access was never the same as control. Knowledge guarded by institutions did not automatically become mercy for the powerless. A palace might possess remedies and still deny them to those whose bodies served its interests. So Nefaret waited, counting days with a terror that had no proper language. Then the body answered. Something changed. At first she blamed food, heat, exhaustion, fear. But the truth gathered slowly. Undeniably, like water filling a sealed jar. She was pregnant. The silence inside her became enormous. She told no one. Not Hanet. Not Itit. Not the women who watched too closely. But that evening, while pouring wine, her hand trembled. Itet saw. Of course she saw. Friendship in captivity sharpened perception. Itet said nothing, but that night the cup beside Neferet's mat was larger than usual. Neferet drank all of it. She lay awake until the light changed and understood with a clarity that felt almost calm, something had to end. Not because escape was safe. Not because freedom promised kindness. Not because she knew where to go. But because remaining had become another kind of death. One that would not stop with her. Inside her, unnamed and unconsulted, another life had begun its claim upon the future. She did not yet know whether she loved it. She did not know whether she feared it more than the palace. She only knew that the child, whoever had fathered it, must not first learn the world through locked doors. Neferet did not flee immediately. Panic ran. Survival observed. For weeks, she became more obedient than before. That was part of the deception. The palace expected despair, carelessness, perhaps sickness, perhaps pleading. It did not expect patience from those it had underestimated. She smiled when required. Lowered her eyes at the correct angle. Answered with measured humility. Performed the routines so smoothly that she became almost invisible again. But inside, she counted. The east entrance guard stood longer at his post when the night meal was late. The lamps in the outer corridor were replaced shortly after the second watch. The inner courtyard grew quiet after the last trays returned from the upper rooms. A side door near storage was sometimes left unlatched when servants carried linen through in haste. The western guards shared food together on certain nights, not by order, but by habit. Habit was weaker than law because men trusted it too much. She stored these details in herself like stolen grain. At night, when others slept, she rehearsed the path without moving. From mat to threshold. Threshold to corridor. Corridor to side passage. Side passage to courtyard. Courtyard along the wall. Storage buildings. Gate. Latch. Open ground. River. Road. Field. The word field nearly broke her each time. Not because it was frightening, but because it was warm. It brought back the mud brick house, her mother's cooking fire, her brother's face. And there, she discovered a new terror. Her brother's face had begun to blur. She remembered his outline. His size. His waving hand. But not clearly enough. The palace had not only taken her from home. It had continued taking home from her memory, grain by grain. That frightened her more than guards. One night, she pressed her hands against the palace wall and tried to remember the warmth of her mother's house. Mud brick held the sun differently. It softened at evening. Palace stone remained cold even after heat. It had no memory of bodies. She whispered her own name once. Nefaret. The palace had used it. Men had spoken it. Women had warned it. But beneath those uses, there remained the first meaning, the one her mother had given before the world corrupted it. Beautiful. Not as price. Not as invitation. Not as property. Beautiful as the fact of being alive. 3 nights later, the side door was left unlatched again. This time she did not move. She waited. Escape, she knew, was not the art of seeing one opening. It was the discipline of surviving until the right opening returned. On the 3rd night, it did. She woke before the guards changed. For a moment, she did not move. She listened to the room breathe. Women asleep. One muttering. One turning. It at somewhere close, quiet but perhaps awake. Nefaret wanted to touch her hand, to say something, to leave a sign. She did not. Farewells created evidence. Love had to remain silent if it wished to protect the beloved. She reached for her cloth bundle. The comb was still there. The folded linen. The space where the blue bead had once rested, lost, traded, hidden, or taken during some earlier day she could no longer bear to examine. Its absence hurt like a missing tooth. She pressed the bundle to her face. For one breath, she allowed herself to be a child holding the last remnant of home. Then she rose. The corridor was quiet. She moved close to the wall, not quickly at first. Speed belonged to those already discovered. She had practiced this walk in thought, controlled, soft, steady. The darkness did not hide her completely, but it softened the edges. Her bare feet knew stone, then threshold, then a cooler draft. The side door stood where memory had placed it. Her palm touched wood. The air beyond slipped through the gap. Outside air. Not courtyard air. Not perfumed chamber air. Not incense-thick ceremonial air. Night air. She nearly wept from the feel of it. But freedom did not reward astonishment. She slipped through. The courtyard opened before her, wide and exposed beneath the stars. Shadows from the wall lay long across the ground. She crossed within them, low and silent, every sense sharpened until the world seemed made of separate sounds, a torch crackling somewhere, a guard's cough, fabric shifting against her chest, her own heart pounding so loudly she was certain it had become public. No one called out. No hand seized her. She reached the storage passage between 2 low buildings. It smelled of grain, old linen, dust, mice. At the far end waited a wooden gate. Older than the inner doors. Less honored. Less watched. The latch was iron. Simple. She lifted it. It caught. The sound was small, but fear enlarged it until it seemed to strike the sky. Footsteps. Nefaret flattened herself against the wall. A guard passed beyond the storage building. His torch cast a trembling orange blade across the ground near her feet. The light paused. Perhaps he had heard something. Perhaps some god, bored and cruel, had decided to hold that moment open. Nefaret stopped breathing. Inside her, the child was silent. The torch moved on. The footsteps faded. She lifted the latch again, this time slowly, guiding the metal as if soothing an animal. The gate opened. And then she stood outside the palace. Outside. No corridor contained her. No painted wall instructed her. No guard stood close enough to define the direction of her eyes. The night received her without ceremony. Beyond the walls, the Nile moved in darkness, wide and ancient, indifferent to kings. It had fed villages, drowned fields, carried boats, reflected stars, swallowed secrets. It had seen girls taken and men crowned and mothers kneeling before empty thresholds. It had outlived every name carved in stone. To the people of that world, the river could divide life and death, east and west, cultivation and wilderness, known and unknown. Nefaret did not cross it. Not yet. But standing near it, with the palace behind her and open ground ahead, she felt that some crossing had already occurred. She began to walk. Not run. Running confessed. Walking claimed belonging. She walked like someone sent on an errand. Like someone expected. Like someone whose absence had not yet become alarm. She walked until the palace walls shrank behind her. Walked until torchlight blurred. Walked until the only lamps were stars. Then, when the road dipped near a stretch of dry earth touched by canal damp, she stopped. She sat. Her legs shook. Her hands shook. Her whole body seemed to understand freedom before her mind could bear it. She placed both palms flat against the ground. The soil was cool. It smelled faintly of fields. Not her field, perhaps, but close enough that memory stirred. She was free. And instantly she understood that freedom was not the opposite of fear. Freedom was fear without walls. It was hunger without a schedule. It was danger without known corridors. It was a question so large it could not be answered by stepping through a gate. Where would she sleep? Who would recognize her? Was her family still alive? Would her mother open her arms or cover her mouth in grief? Would her father turn away again? Would the village see a daughter returned, or a ruined thing carrying the palace inside her? She pressed a hand to her stomach. She was not alone. The knowledge did not comfort her yet. The stars above were the same stars that had watched her childhood. That was the cruelty of stars. They remained faithful while human lives became unrecognizable beneath them. The girl who had once lain beneath those stars near her mother's house had believed the world was small: house, field, river, brothers, bread. Now the world had become enormous and unsafe. She opened the bundle and touched the folded linen. It no longer smelled of home. Time had taken even that. Still, she held it. Meaning did not always survive in scent or color or form. Sometimes meaning survived because the hand refused to let go. Behind her, the Nile moved. Ahead, the field waited. She stood and chose the field. The dry grass bent beneath her feet. Each step carried her farther from the palace and deeper into uncertainty. Her body wanted to hurry, but she forced a rhythm. The night belonged to hunters, fugitives, traders, priests, thieves, spirits, and the desperate. She did not know which category would keep her safest, so she tried to resemble none too strongly. Then the thought returned. What if the child belonged to him? She did not complete the name in her mind. Some names gave power even when unspoken. Her breath caught. For a moment, the field seemed to tilt. Freedom, which had felt vast and cold, now became tangled with inheritance. Could one flee a palace while carrying its blood? Could a child be innocent and still terrifying? Could a mother love what reminded her of captivity? These were not questions a young woman should have had to answer beneath pursuit. But history had never been gentle about timing. Behind her, a light appeared. Then another. Torches. Small at first, moving insects of fire near the horizon. Searching. For several heartbeats, she stood frozen. The old training returned: stillness, silence, waiting for instruction. Then another self rose in her. Not the trained girl. Not the sold child. Not the silent object in the room. The watcher. The survivor. The one who had counted footsteps. The one who had learned that obedience could be performed while rebellion grew underneath. She ran. Bare feet struck earth. The bundle pressed against her chest. The field tore at her ankles. Her heart became louder than pursuit, louder than memory. Louder than the river. She did not look back. Looking back belonged to the morning she left the village. She had survived that by refusing to turn. She would survive this the same way. The darkness opened and closed around her. She ran toward no certainty. Only away from possession. And perhaps that was how many freedoms began in the ancient world, not as declarations, not as laws, not as songs, but as a frightened body moving through darkness because remaining had become impossible. Behind her, men carried fire. Ahead, the road vanished into night. Inside her, a future without a name traveled with her. And somewhere beneath the terror, beneath the grief, beneath the question of whether the past could ever be outrun, Nefaret understood something the palace had never intended to teach her. A person could be made powerless for years and still keep, hidden somewhere below obedience, the final instinct to belong to herself. That instinct was not victory. Not yet. It was smaller than victory and older than language. It was the soul placing one foot before the other after history had already written its verdict. It was the refusal to let the last word be owned by those who had owned everything else. So she ran. And the night, for all its dangers, did not close its gate. When we look back now, across centuries and sand, we are tempted to ask what became of her. Did she reach the village? Did she find her mother alive? Did she hide among workers, widows, healers, boat people, temple servants? Did she give birth under another name? Did the child live? Did she ever speak of the palace? Did Itet survive? Did Hanat notice the empty mat and, for one private moment, close her eyes not in anger but in recognition? History gives us no answer. But perhaps the silence itself is an answer of another kind. The ancient world preserved what power considered important. It carved kings into stone and painted noble women in profile, serene and scented, holding lotus blossoms before eternity. It recorded harvests, taxes, divine offerings, military triumphs, and the names of men who believed their names could defeat death. Yet the lives most wounded by power often passed without inscription. No scribe followed Nefaret into the field. No official recorded the tremor in her father's hand. No temple relief showed her mother washing her hair for the last time. No royal archive preserved the cup of water it had left in the dark. But absence is not proof of insignificance. Sometimes it is proof of what the powerful feared to see. For what was a palace, finally, if not a beautiful machine built from invisible lives? What was empire, if not the arrangement of other people's hunger into someone else's glory? What was wealth, if it required children to learn silence before they learned desire? Nefaret's story, whether remembered by name or reconstructed from the shadows of many unnamed lives, asks something of us still. It asks whether survival can be mistaken for consent. It asks how many cruelties have been hidden behind words like honor, protection, duty, opportunity, tradition. It asks how often families, cornered by famine or debt, have been made to participate in systems they would have rejected if love alone could feed a child. And it asks what freedom truly means. Because when Nefaret stepped outside the palace, she did not step into safety. She stepped into consequence. Freedom did not erase what had happened. It did not return childhood. It did not restore the father's courage, the mother's peace, the brother's clear face in memory. It did not remove the child from her body or the palace from her dreams. Some things did not stay behind. That was the final cruelty. But also, perhaps, the beginning of wisdom. The past could follow. So could the self. And in the long night beyond the walls, with torches behind her and no promise ahead, Nefaret carried both. She carried what had been done to her. She carried what remained untouched. She carried the terrible burden of memory. She carried the fragile evidence that even after a world has named someone property, that person may still rise in the dark, find the side door, lift the latch, and choose the field. And maybe that was why her story, though never written by her own hand, still feels alive. Not because she escaped completely. Perhaps no one escapes completely. But because she moved. One step. Then another. Toward hunger, danger, uncertainty, and the vast merciless mercy of open air. Toward a future that had not been granted to her. Toward a name she would have to make again. Toward the painful, unfinished work of becoming human after being treated as less than one. And if we listen carefully, beneath all the monuments and hymns and royal names, we may still hear her footsteps. Not loud. Not triumphant. But continuing. This story's emotional force comes from the fact that escape is not treated as a clean ending. The deepest wound was never merely captivity. It was the way captivity followed the survivor into freedom. Nefaret had crossed the gate. She had stepped beyond the palace walls. She had felt the night air on her skin and the open earth beneath her feet. But memory crossed with her. The corridor followed. The cup of water followed. Her father's trembling hand followed. Her mother's silence followed. The empty mat followed. The palace did not need walls anymore. It had become a shadow inside the mind. That was why her freedom was not simple triumph. It was unfinished. It was human. It was historically tragic because the world that harmed her may never have written her name. And it was psychologically true because survival does not end when the door opens. Freedom may open the gate, but memory still has to cross the field. And perhaps that is the question she leaves behind for us. When a person escapes the place that wounded them, how long does it take for the soul to arrive?